Did Rucker McGroarty play all of us for fools? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, some juicy stories coming out of the whole Rucker McGroarty saga. Obviously, that continues to move right along, and with some of the, I don't know if I would call it allegations or some speculation around what exactly has transpired that led to this whole situation getting to where it is. There's been some interesting fingers being pointed in Rucker's direction, and I thought it'd be worth chatting about that in just one moment. Before we get into what we might be unpacking here and whether or not it's going to make us all much angrier as Jets fans, just wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Now, like I said, we recently saw from Sean Reynolds. He was giving a podcast discussion the other day, and intriguingly, it came up about Rucker McGroarty, and specifically the whole allegation that McGroarty was not given a pathway to a Jet spot in camp, right? Which we heard speculation from one unnamed source that was one of the concerns with respect to how Cole Perfetti was treated, how Ville Heinola has been treated, etc. Right? So on the one hand, you saw some basis for that particular argument, but where it gets interesting is that Reynolds basically insinuated McGroarty might have been lying the whole time about wanting to play for the Jets, and that, in fact, he has essentially not ever had a real interest in signing with Winnipeg, and that all of the media stuff that he did when he got drafted was generally for show, and that it wasn't really genuine, which I find to be a very interesting thought process. I can't say that given the way that he's reacted that I disagree. I think McGroarty may have not really been all that interested in signing with the Jets. Maybe he was at one point. I don't know. We can only surmise from outside perspectives, but the fact that McGroarty went on camera and did all of this stuff and was like really in the public eye, and everyone kept anointing him as a future captain, and then all of a sudden it was just like that almost overnight. It's a little strange, right? The way that it all sort of broke down was just weird. And for me, I just don't really understand what the thought process here was. I can certainly blame the Jets for not planning as well for this as I would have liked. I think it would have been nicer if there was a clearer path to the NHL for a kid coming out of the NCAA. We all knew this was coming, so it would have been nice to feel like, there was more of a development track and a pathway for a player like McGroarty to actually join the NHL. But here's the thing, right? A lot of our top prospects have all spent time with the Moose. That is like zero shocker, no surprise. Almost everyone that has ever played for this team that wasn't already a seasoned pro or was basically just a drafted prospect has come in here and played at the AHL level. Even Kyle Connor spent like 45 to 50 games there. So for Rutger, I don't entirely buy the whole lack of a promise of an NHL spot was what prompted this, right? I think that there's an argument that it plays a part in it, but I do think it was very strange how the whole situation went down. And so if he was really not telling the truth about his interest in signing with the Jets, if it is in fact that Winnipeg was kind of more, I would say, gosh, how do I put this? I don't want to say exonerated fully because I feel like that's not the right choice of words, but if they're a little bit off the hook here, then it does kind of like make McGroarty not look that great. And I sort of wonder going forward, does this have a significant impact on his trade value, right? Because teams are probably looking at all of this and they're thinking to themselves, this kid might be a problem. And if we can't really convince him to sign, and if he's not really being truthful about his intentions, what incentive do we have to give up assets for him? In the past, we've seen like Adam Fox basically tell Carolina he was not signing with them. But then, he ends up, I think it was a second round pick or something like that. I forget what the exact trade was back then. But, he then goes to the New York Rangers and actually signs for them, because that's basically where he said the whole time he wanted to sign. I don't know if teams are really going to be doing that these days. I think at this point, a player like McGroarty might be a bit more of a headache than he's worth. And you think about his potential, right? He could be a top 6 player, but that skating is always going to be a bit of a problem for him. And so would teams really want to give that much for McGroarty? And maybe this is why when we were at the trade, I guess, draft table stuff, where Chevy's on the phone with San Jose and a few other teams, maybe this is why teams were not really interested in bringing him on. Maybe it kind of got out that he's not really being as truthful about his intentions as, you would like. And I'm not saying that this is all true. I don't know. I don't know that Sean was necessarily suggesting it's 100% the case. It may have been something that he's heard from within the org. I would imagine that somebody has somewhere said something, and that's why he sort of picked up on the story and was willing to talk about it a little bit more openly. But it's very interesting that, this is coming out, as I think both camps are probably positioning to try and, force some leverage here. But if it's the Jets, I don't think you want this getting out that he's a pain, right? Because then you're going to have trouble moving him. They already saw how the Dubois thing went down, and I don't know if teams are going to be that interested in acquiring yet another problem child, which, I don't know that Rucker is necessarily, but based on how he's behaved in these negotiations and stuff and how his camp has acted, I'm also not inclined to believe the story's false. There's just a lot there that I think suggests that maybe the Jets are a little more blameless than they usually are in some of these situations. Like I said, I think the whole lack of planning thing is still a legitimate concern, but I'm hopeful that they are going forward, changing how they approach things. If you notice this year, there were no college kids drafted. They even had a chance to try and trade up to get Zeev Buim, and they just didn't. So very interesting from Winnipeg's perspective. If you're the Jets, I sort of wonder how much this has damaged the NCAA pipeline going forward. And I feel like that's really unfortunate because a lot of the Jets' best players have all come through college. Andrew Kopp at one point did when he was still here. Obviously, Kyle Connor has. You've got a number of other players. Dylan Sandberg is an NCAA kid. So it's not like, college kids just don't sign here. That's a lie and it's not true. But you do have to ask yourself, with such a high pick turning this sour so quickly, is this kind of the end for NCAA picks, at least in the upper rounds? And I would imagine most likely, I think the Jets are probably going to look to do more CHL players, but I also think that league-wide, I sort of wonder if teams are looking at this and starting to re-examine whether or not the rules and qualifications for college kids needs to change. I don't know that that's necessarily the best solution, but it could be a thing that some teams, especially with markets that have limited leverage, are thinking about. So either way, it sucks that it's gotten to this point. And if this is really how Rucker feels about things, well, all I can say is good luck to him on his next team. All I know is that, at this level, it can be a harsh wake-up call for the kids who think that they're above a franchise. And I don't know that that's the case here, but if he's trying to pick his destination, he might be in for a bit of a rude awakening. Teams sometimes don't always take kindly to this sort of stuff, and they will correct kids and put them in line really quickly. So, don't count your blessings too quickly. Always have at least a little bit of a dose of humility. And if all of that really was just for show, it's unfortunate because I felt like he really was going to be a guy that you could have seen wearing a letter on his chest at some point. But, I'm not him. I can't, fight or argue for him. I can't tell him what to do. He just has to make these decisions on his own, and he'll have to live with the consequences. So good luck to him on his next team. But all I'm saying is I'm hoping that trade comes sooner than later. But in the meantime, the Jets are still active in the offseason. Trades are certainly something that they're exploring, I'm sure, but they're still making a couple of free agent ads. We'll talk about one recently that has just been picked up and why I think he presents an interesting opportunity for the Jets to think about how they look at, low risk, potentially moderate upside sorts of players. We'll get into that acquisition in just a moment. But before we go any further, Did want to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Like building a Stanley Cup champion team, eBay Motors totally understands that you're going to need some special parts to get your car or vehicle into the tip-top shape. And that's why they've got a great selection of superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions to apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting about Winnipeg's offseason so far. It's been somewhat quiet unless you're talking about the Rutger McGroarty case, in which point there's just tons of crap going on, and certainly every time we hear some new twist, it's not particularly fun for the Jets, but it does make the team look a little bit less bad, I would say, or a lot less bad depending on your perspective. So in between, the Jets have still made some signings. They're still doing some stuff on the depth side of things. I don't know if they're really chasing any big free agents on the market now, but maybe they are, and they just haven't really talked about it. Before we dive into their latest acquisition out of Carolina, just wanted to let you know, for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because there's too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, coming back to acquisitions, the Jets are apparently bringing in Dylan Coghlan on a trade out of Carolina. I guess I called him a free agent. He's really not, but he basically costs a conditional 7th-round pick, and I'm going to guess the condition is he plays some level of NHL games. I have no idea. In terms of this trade, so you're getting a guy who's like a depth 7th defender on the right-handed side. He's 26. He had a couple of decentish years for the Vegas Golden Knights. Hasn't really played much since, but in terms of a guy who has like low risk, potentially some upside if, he shows well with a Moose or something, it's a really nice little swing, right? I think the Jets have to do more of this kind of stuff where they're looking for players who are perhaps cosmetically lacking something, right? There's just some part of their game that's maybe not quite there. But you know what? In terms of like right-sided depth, if he gets called up because of injury, you probably aren't too upset. Winnipeg really needs to look in the margins here for value because let's be real, right? The team doesn't have a lot of top-end talent in some very specific positions. Aside from like Morrissey and a few others, most of Winnipeg's high-end skill comes in net or in some cases on the wings, right? We don't have like a lot of elite centers. We've got Scheifele, who's very good, but past him, you start to realize things are a little bit more up for grabs, right? The fact that you have prospects potentially fighting for your second line spot is maybe a little bit of a sign that the core itself is not only aging out, but that it also doesn't have quite as much franchise level talent as you would like it to. Morrissey and Hellebuck are definitely two of the exceptions. They are just stone cold killers. But the rest of the team, it could use a little bit of improvement. And sometimes rounding out your depth and sort of raising the floor is a really good approach if you're a team like the Jets and you're working with limited resources. Now, I don't want you to assume that this means the Jets should have signed Monahan, right? Monahan is a floor raiser, but he's not the kind that I'm looking for. Sean's a good player, but he had some very specific problems that I thought would be, rough for the Jets going forward. And with respect to raising the floor, I think you can do that on a budget. And that's where a guy like Coghlin kind of makes a lot of sense, right? He's a low-risk gamble, most likely Moose fodder, but he may actually get some Jets games at some point if some folks get injured. And again, as like a 7th rotational D, he'd be a pretty solid option. He also gives you some organizational depth on that right side, which Winnipeg is very thin in. He does still have some marginal upside. Again, probably not looking at more than a third pairing guy, but, he has shown okay in some previous samples. His Carolina stint was relatively short and not super impressive, but again, if you're looking for reclamation projects or low risk swings that can help bring you some organizational value, this is the kind of stuff that I think the Jets can really make use of. In a team like Carolina, Coghlin basically has no value. He's never getting in the lineup. He's not supplanting anyone on that team. And so he's just sitting there kind of rotting. And that's where, for Winnipeg, he'd actually probably get at least a couple of games at some point in the coming seasons. Again, for a conditional 7th round pick, he's basically free. So you really can't complain. And it's these sorts of acquisitions that I think the Jets should really be looking at. I talked about Philip Zadina and maybe Kyler Yamamoto as being potentially interesting reclamation projects, although I'd lean more towards Zadina, less interested in Yamamoto. I think Yamamoto is probably what he is at this point, but I feel like with Zadina, he still has some potential to be a very interesting player, especially because he's just a really good skater. That's a trait that the Jets just don't have enough of. And if you're looking for a cheap ad who could maybe boost your transition game or something, maybe Zadina would be worth the risk. And again, I'm not saying the Jets should spend $2 million or $3 million on players like this, but if you can get them on a relatively cheap, inexpensive contract, a bit of a show me deal, and they do well for you, that's great, right? You've not only helped them get, more cash on their next deal, but you've also gotten some real value out of their play in whatever role that you've asked them to be in. So for me, I think it's important to look in these margins for value. I think the Jets can really make use of data science to find that value. And that's where, this whole Arneal thing about moving towards a more data science-based approach when it comes to roster building makes me intrigued. I don't want to say that you should live and die by the numbers. That's not the truth, right? You have to have a more holistic view of what that data means. And I think that's where a lot of times folks have kind of bristled against the idea of data analysis because they look at it and they're just like, well, the spreadsheets say one thing, but my eyes are telling me something else. And sometimes there's an incongruency stylistically, right? But I think with a lot of it, you can still make use of data to help you find some good value that's maybe buried under the surface. That's how a guy like Sonny Milano has really become a key contributor for the Caps, right? For some reason, he continually gets overlooked. And sure, he does get injured a fair bit, but overall, right, their investment into him was pretty marginal. They've gotten some fantastic goal scoring out of him in a depth role. Players like him, Evan Rodriguez, these sort of underrated talents that have maybe flown under the radar, they've always shown pretty well by underlying stats. And that's where I think having a deeper appreciation of how you can translate that data into actual success is a really helpful skill, and hopefully something that the Jets start to make use of over the next few years. I think if they do that, you're going to see them avoid some really bad contracts. I think that they'll be a smarter organization overall, and hopefully they'll stop chasing some of these deals like the Monahan contract. The fact that Winnipeg was really aggressive and offering a fair bit for that does make me a little concerned. You shouldn't have to be bailed out by other teams making really poor choices to make your own. I think that says you still don't quite get what's wrong with that approach. And I feel like, the Jets maybe haven't leveled up yet to the level that I'm hoping. But it is going to be a slow growth process. And hopefully more deals like the Coghlin deal and maybe they sign a Zadina or something and show that they're really thinking about how to extract as much value out of these, maybe smaller time deals as you can. They've done it before. Look at how much they got out of Dylan DeMello, right? A seemingly throwaway defenseman for a lot of teams. And he's been one of our key anchors for much of his tenure. So some stuff to think about. We'll see what Coghlin is. I obviously, I'm thinking he's a Moose player, but maybe he has a big camp or something and really wows us. But let me know what you're thinking about in terms of some potential surprise signings or trades. Drop those thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. In the meantime, one final point of interest, I thought I'd talk about something interesting that a Twitter account brought up, and it's that prospect camp has been kind of quiet so far. We're not seeing a lot of stuff being said about it, or not a lot of press and media, which I think is kind of interesting. We'll chat about what that might be, or what reasoning might be behind it in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up really quickly. Just thought I would finish up with some thoughts on, an ongoing training camp. Obviously, the Jets are currently inviting some rookies and prospects in for the next couple of days. They've just had, I think this is the second day of camp so far. And intriguingly, and I hadn't even really thought about this, but we really haven't seen a lot of press and media coverage on it, right? There's been some tweets and stuff. There's been some videos and footage. But overall, compared to the Rucker McGroarty class, it feels like we really haven't seen much of anything. If you look at Winnipeg's Twitter, it's like a couple of players giving some brief little talks or whatever, and like pickleball videos, right? Other than that, just generally pretty quiet, which I find interesting. I wonder if McGroarty and the way that his whole press campaign worked has kind of scared the Jets off from really spotlighting individual players and putting a huge face on them for the fan base, because inevitably, if it goes south, it suddenly feels a lot worse for those who had a real connection to them. So it makes me wonder if that's part of it. I mean, in terms of like prospect intrigue, we have some really cool guys. You've got Barlow, you've got Lucius coming back, you've got Kevin He making his debut, Lambert, of course, and a few goalies. So, I mean, there's genuine talent here to be really excited about. Alphonse Fry, if you haven't seen his little interview about having been in Winnipeg, like in 2015, I think it was, you should definitely look that up. It's funny. He was talking about being here for like some sort of Pee-wee hockey tournament or something. And, he said he lost all of his games, but, he's glad to be back. And it's kind of fun that he was able to recreate the photo at one of the arenas with some Jets banners, although this time he only had one Jets player on one of the banners and the team logo on the other. So not quite able to recreate it 1-to-1, but, about as close as it gets. Very cool to see him. He seems like a really cool kid, and based on his game, he's talking about modeling it after Erik Karlsson and stuff, which sounds about right. I think most Swedish young defenders probably look at Hedman, Karlsson, and a few others as the prototypes for how they should be moving about on the ice. So Fry looks to be pretty exciting, but you notice that you're not really seeing loads of other content. I mean, again, the fact that like pickleball is like half of what's on Winnipeg's current feed tells you that maybe they're taking a bit of a step back this year. And this is a social media team that's been really active and really aggressive. But maybe the whole McGroarty case and the fact that it's gone this south so quickly has kind of, made them a little bit skittish about really getting excited about certain players and prospects. So it is what it is. It's unfortunate, but I will say that, once we start getting closer to preseason, there's a couple of players that I'm really interested in. Jacob Julian, I'm curious to know how he's looking as he's continued to develop. I think he has one more year of eligibility in junior, and then he can potentially hit the pros. That should be good. Then you've got Lambert and Chibrikov, of course, who will be really big features for Winnipeg's forward unit this upcoming season. And then after that, you've, of course, got some of our newcomers. You've got Fry. From the returning cast, Salamonson, I'm very interested to see him. Salamonson, I think, has an inside track to potentially fight for the 7th roster spot on the blue line. Now, that's sort of pending any trades. I sort of wonder what Winnipeg's approach is here, because they do like Pionk a lot, but I do wonder if his cap hit and the fact that he's in, the last year of his deal and honestly has not really been able to put up the numbers that I think you would want him to, makes the team sort of reconsider whether or not they retain him. There was a suggestion from Murat Atesh a while back that, the Jets were interested in potentially re-signing him, which I think my feeling about that. It's not really what I would personally do. Again, as a person, love him. Great guy. I think he's very accountable. And he's like as nice as can possibly be. I think my concern is, unfortunately, the results on the ice haven't exactly aligned. And that is kind of one of the biggest standards that you have to be measured by. So for Winnipeg, I think it's probably more helpful if they can find a way out of that deal. I know it's only the last year of it, but getting that cap space back to potentially make a bigger swing elsewhere could be really helpful for Winnipeg. So, it is what it is. The Jets are going to have some tough decisions to make, and I'm curious to know if preseason and camp are going to make them even harder. I expect that the 3 players that I've sort of outlined previously, Lambert, Chibrikov, and Heinola, are basically going to be the three young studs that really have a sizable impact and actually make the team out of camp and or preseason and stuff. But I wonder if there's some level of competition for other spots. I don't know who else would really be fighting for a spot other than Salamonson, because like forward-wise, you don't really have enough out of Barlow yet. He's just, made the pros, and he still has a lot of work and development to do. So he's probably out. I think Lucius is maybe one of the sleeper names that I'm kind of keeping an eye on. Chaz has had a horrendous streak of fortune over the past several years. I feel like of the prospects that have sort of gotten away, he's really hit like Luke Green status. When Green was drafted, he was like a really good, really fun two-way D with a big shot. And, the shoulder injuries and stuff basically forced him into a semi-early retirement. I think he's actually coaching like a hockey camp these days, which for a guy who quite honestly could have been on Winnipeg's third pairing right now, had he been able to stay healthy, it's really unfortunate, that his career was sidelined by injury. And it's not like that's a new experience. It does happen to quite a few players. I will say that, for Lucius, there's two things that have been a little bit fortunate. One, all the injuries have generally been separate. You're not seeing as many aggravations of the same things. And I guess the second thing is, if there's a player on this Jets team that knows about the troubles of going through multiple rehabs and what looks like nearly career-ending injuries, it's Gabriel Vilardi. Vilardi has a lot of experience with that. I'm honestly amazed that he's even playing. I was worried for a while when he was, in the couple of seasons after his Kings drafting, that he was not going to be around in the NHL for very long. In fact, I didn't even know if he was going to make it, because he was dealing with a ton, and I mean a ton, of injuries. So I'm very happy that he's made it. It's great to see, of all things, that he's ended up in Winnipeg. And I think it just shows you that sometimes these pathways are not linear, and you just have to be patient and willing to work through it. I'm really hoping that Lucius can stay healthy. A full year of pro hockey for him is fantastic. He had, among many of our prospects, one of the highest ceilings, a guy who could have been on that Kyle Connor tier of player, had it not come down to some serious injuries, basically derailing the last 3 to 4 years of his development. I don't know what he's going to be like at the end of his career, but what I do hope is that he gets a chance to really show what he can be for the Jets. He always shows flashes of greatness when he gets into camp in preseason, and now it's just staying healthy and either getting a full season with the Moose or wherever he can at some point over the next year or so. I'm really holding out hope for him. I'm crossing my fingers. He seems like a great guy. I think he's a player that could actually help the Jets in the top 6 if he can stay healthy. I think his ceiling has probably dipped a little bit, in part thanks to all the injuries and delays in his development cycle. But, there's a chance that he still has a lot left in the tank to give the Jets. So something to keep an eye out for. Let me know what sleeper prospects you're interested in and who you're tracking for this upcoming camp and preseason. Drop your thoughts below. Probably next episode, we might talk about the Jets schedule. It seems like Winnipeg's schedule in terms of rest is pretty forgiving. Lots more weekend games. And, I love that, because I actually get to have a slightly normal watching time instead of like 10 p.m. at night on, in the middle of the week, which is always a little bit harder. But again, drop your thoughts on the current prospects and training camp below, or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here next week for more Jets offseason coverage. So see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.